Shalom, sweetest friends. There's a fascinating piece of Torah from the Rav that I wish to share with you. This is in regards to the concept of Sfeika D'Yoma. The doubt that we had about which day the new moon was sighted ended up causing us to doubt when the holidays were. That's the concept of Sfeika D'Yoma. That's why we have 2 days of Pesach and 2 days of Sukkot and such for those living in Chutz La'aretz. So outside the land of Israel, people kept 2 days of Chag, while in Israel, they kept only 1 day of Chag. This is the idea of Sfeika D'Yoma. It's been asked now that we're counting the Omer, why does the suffix not progress onwards? How come we really now know what day 1 of the Omer is, day 2, day 3? First, we didn't know which day was the first day of Pesach. And now we're counting. This counting should be just as ambiguous. Instead of counting day 1 and then count day 2 and then count day 3, maybe we should say this is maybe 1 or 2. This is maybe 2 or 3. This day is maybe 3 or 4, and so on. The Rav cites an answer as to why this Sfeika D'Yoma doesn't apply to Sfirat HaOmer. First, he gives an answer from his own Rebbe, his Musmach, the one who gave him Smicha, the Dvar Avram, Avram Duber Kahana Shapiro. He was the chief rabbi in the city of Kovno in 1923. He is in the same ranks as Reb Chaim Ozer, and these guys were one of the greatest Lithuanian poskim. Greatest. And the Dvar Avram was the last chief rabbi of Lithuania. The Dvar Avram also conferred smicha, as I said, on the Rav Soloveitchik. So they had an immensely close relationship. And I need to insist that the Dvar Avram was credited, was made mention that anything that comes out of the Rav's mouth in referencing to his Talmud, Rav Soloveitchik, is binding halacha. So the fact that I'm about to give a disagreement between Rav Soloveitchik and the Dvar Avram shouldn't bother you so much, because the Dvar Avram already gave his approval of what the Rav says coming forward. So the Dvar Avram's answer to this question about Sfeika D'Yoma in regards to Sfirat HaOmer is this. He says it's simply math. It's just math. We're counting. And math is a perfect science. There's no ambiguity when you're counting. Nobody sits and counts coins. Maybe 1 coin, maybe 2. Maybe 3 coins, maybe 4. And puts them in a bag like that. No, people say 1 coin, and they add the 2nd coin, and 3rd coin in the bag, and the 4th coin in the bag. 111 gold pieces, 112 gold pieces, not 111, maybe 112, 112, maybe 113. Nobody counts like that. So counting doesn't go based on some kind of ambiguity. The Rav disagreed with that approach. He said this isn't an idea of counting. He said that if that was the case, if it was that whenever there's an imprecise counting that we don't know and therefore we can't fulfill it, well, in the time of the Gemara, they didn't have a set calendar yet. And all those Amoraim would have been, at least we would have been told of one probably that didn't do the counting because of this problem. But that the Gemara never says that. It never says that because they didn't have a precise calendar that they couldn't count the Omer. So it can't be for reasons that when counting is a precise thing, we measure it only as such in regards to the Omer. But when it's not a precise thing, we don't do it bichlal, because that wasn't the way it applied. So the Rav brilliantly shows how Sfeika D'Yoma applies only when there's a connection of Kedushas Hayom. The inyan of Sfirat HaOmer doesn't involve a mitzvahs Hayom with each day of Sfira. It's not connected to Pesach, to the holiness of Pesach. It's its own mitzvah, and it's not inherent in establishing a Kedushas Hayom. There is no ritual that we do that all of a sudden transforms the day into holy. For example, like Kiddush on Yom Tov. Kiddush on Yom Tov makes the day, it signifies that this day is holy. And as such, we want to make sure we don't miss the opportunity to engage the proper Kedushas Hayom. So we observe 2 days. In an effort to not miss the opportunity to engage in Kedushas Hayom, we make sure to say Kiddush on both days. But by Sfirat HaOmer, there is no concept of Kedushas Hayom. So Sfeika D'Yoma doesn't apply to days of Sfira. The Rav brings an example of Rosh Hashanah from words of the Beis Yosef and Reb Chaim, even though we don't paskin like them. Why do we keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah? Even in Eretz Yisrael, they keep 2 days. They were afraid. What were they so afraid of? So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah describes a fear of that. Were they going to be told on time? Weren't they going to be told on time? They didn't know. Is today really Aleph Tishrei or not? The Gemara discusses that. But what happens? In Musaf, the Beis Yosef tells us that on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, by Musaf they would say Musfei Yom, because it's not only Rosh Hashanah, but it's also Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So we say Musfei Yom, plural Musafs. That's how we say it. The Beis Yosef says that on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, it was never practiced that we would consider it to be Rosh Chodesh Tishrei in addition to Rosh Hashanah. Not at all. Rosh Chodesh Tishrei already happened. Rosh Chodesh Tishrei was never 2 days. So what would you think you should say at Musaf of the second day? Yeah. Don't say Musfei Yom, but say Musaf Hayom. In the singular. The Beis Yosef paskins this way. Reb Chaim, by the way, he also, being the Rav's grandfather, he paskin that way too. But we don't paskin that way. But the Rav is bringing a beautiful point from here. What's the logic here? Musaf has nothing to do with the Kedushas Hayom, the mitzvah of the day. Therefore, it doesn't get caught up in the whole issue of Sfeika D'Yoma. And here's another example. The Gemara in Menachos discusses the halacha of Chadash. One may not eat Chadash, that's wheat that's considered new, because it was harvested at the time after the second day of Pesach. So it's a law that one can only use the flour or the wheat harvested from the time before Pesach of this year. So for example, we now can eat the flour that was made from wheat harvested last summer. So they are currently, we're going to come to the summer months, they're going to be harvesting wheat. And a lot of the stores, a lot of those kosher stores, those bakeries are going to buy up all that, are going to buy up a lot of that flour, keep it, so that right after the second day of Pesach next year, they can start using it. So you see that once the summer hits, you have Chadash, you have this new grain that's grown. The fresh wheat is harvested. But once we get to the second day of Pesach, there's a transition that happens, right? It can't be used until the second day of Pesach next year. Most kosher bakeries do this, pizza stores too. They use only Yashan flour. Yashan meaning old, meaning that they use the flour from the previous year. The time before second day of Pesach this year. They use the old flour. So most poskim hold that Yashan applies even outside the land of Israel, but let's not get too distracted with that. If we identify what's the transition point, when does Chadash change? It changes on the second day of Yom Tov. In Israel, that second day would be Chol HaMoed, but in Chutz La'aretz, it's still Yom Tov. Either way, we're allowed to bake and cook on that day. So we ask the question, should Chadash be a problem on the second day or that night of Yom Tov or not? Is this part of the mitzvah of Sfeika D'Yoma, or is it unique to its own? Do you hear? What does the grain of the previous year, when does it become mutter to me? When does this grain become mutter to me? And do I have to wait until the end of the first 2 days? Or only once do I have to wait until the end of the first day? And once the second night hits, I can use it? Or do I have to, only once the first 2 days are completely over, am I now permitted to take the flour from the previous year and then start baking? So the Rav points out that if Chadash is not connected to the mitzvah of Kedushas Hayom, then the mitzvah of Sfeika D'Yoma doesn't apply. Fascinating. And Chadash would be mutter on the second night of the second day, right? The second night of Pesach would all of a sudden make it mutter. In Chutz La'aretz, that would be the second Yom Tov. In Eretz Yisrael, that day or that night would be the first night of Chol HaMoed. So the second night of a 7 or 8 day holiday, however you hold, that wouldn't have Sfeika D'Yoma applied to it, and so you can utilize the flour immediately. Sfeika D'Yoma only applies to Inyanei Mitzvahs Hayom. So to sum up, the Dvar Avram said, this is math, simple math. You can only make an exact count making a count is an exact science. And nobody counts maybe one, maybe two, maybe three. It's just not how people count. The Rav disagreed with this logic. The Rav said that the whole problem of Sfeika D'Yoma doesn't apply to Sfirat HaOmer because Sfirat HaOmer doesn't have aspects of Kedushas Hayom. And as such, Sfeika D'Yoma is not going to apply. The logic is that if their imprecise calendar at the times of the Gemara was an issue in the counting, then we would have had a mention of some Amoraim that didn't do the counting. But mitzvahs Hayom are not indicated as such in the Gemara with Sfirat HaOmer. Mitzvahs Hayom are things like Kiddush and Havdalah and blowing shofar and shaking lulav. All of those things are connected to the Kedusha of the day, of signifying that this day is Kadosh. Sfirat HaOmer is not connected to Pesach. It's mentioned in reference to when we should do the counting. It says Mimacharas HaShabbos, and we learn that has to do with Pesach, and that's just telling me in the Torah when I start the counting. But it's not telling me that it's intrinsically connected to Pesach. Thank you so much. Have a great day.